So this is Structure 1515. Thank you all for joining. And we have had a really good run here. This is now session 7. And as some of you know, we do 15 minutes of presentation, 15 minutes of conversation, and then we continue if you have time. I had a total fail this morning when I did my dry run, and I ran at 27 minutes. So I'm definitely going to have to speed up my delivery. But my goal is to give enough time for conversation after having presented a few ideas to you. So I'm just not going to delay and go straight into the slides. There's plenty to cover here, and then we'll have time to circle back and have some questions and comments afterwards. So our topic today is consensus is key. And it's not just that it is a really valuable decision-making modality for international partnership programs, but it's also really key to understand how it works so we can maximize consensus decision-making in this environment. And as many of you know, I always start with this slide, just because like the tree in the forest, we're not talking about international partnership programs. It doesn't mean that it's not a thing. And so I'm actually here to emphasize that it's a really wonderful modality in the international arena, and that it really makes sense to understand it better so that we can improve upon it and make it even more effective. So very quick definition, international partnership programs, we start in the international arena, one or more international partners, often many, and we have 2 components. That is the definition. We take the old and the new. We take something that's existing, a supporting entity that is not created from scratch, and we tack onto it a governing body, which is an embodiment of the partnership. And that already gives you the international partnership program. Now, the reality is most of these need funding, so very often, and Henrietta, it's great to have you with us since this is your area of expertise, is that the partners will probably add a funding vehicle. So a trust fund will get added, 1 or more. And then we can already see that the supporting entity is likely to provide different kinds of support to the partnership. It can be even multiple supporting entities, but secretariat type support to the governing body and trustee type fiduciary support to the trust fund. Now, if we go all the way back to December, we talked about, at that structure 1515, we distinguished between secretariat and trustee roles, which is helpful to understand when you unpack these structural contexts. And the next one, we talked about trustees, kind of full trustees versus limited trustees. And then the one after that, we unpacked the secretariat and really looked at the inward-outward dynamic that secretariats live every day. And last month, we did the donors. So we brought the donors into the picture, not just as funders, but also as partners. And today, we're going to really zero in on the governing body. But we'll do that particularly with regard to the decision-making of that governing body. And that brings us to consensus. So my tagline is that you have to keep consensus to keep the partnership. And consensus is actually particularly valuable in this context for a number of reasons. And so let me just give you 3 right off the bat. These partnership programs are voluntary. So, basically you have to get people interested to start with, and you have to sustain their interest. And to more or less to varying degrees, these partners can walk. So it's good to make sure that voluntary nature, that partners are interested in and willing to come on board and continue. But by their very nature, by their definition, these partnership programs are also based on cooperation. So we're talking about international partners coming together to collaborate, to coordinate. And if that's not happening, if that's not the prevailing modality, that's the whole raison d'etre, then there's really no reason for the partnership. If you're not getting a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts, you're kind of missing the point. And more particularly in a development environment, we know that development doesn't happen overnight. It really takes a sustained effort. And so in this environment, you want there to be some sustainability where partners stay on for the longer term, and they do that essentially decision by decision. So consensus is really a way to keep everyone on board. And I have this picture from the Guinness Book of World Records. We really don't need that many partners, but we do want to try to keep partnership afloat. So just to recap, in this voluntary, cooperative, sustained effort environment, it's a matter of motivation. You want to keep your partners turned on. It's a matter of mindset. You want to keep your partners tuned in. And it's a matter of MO. You want to keep partners that are continuing to decide. And that's because we're in a programmatic environment. This is not a one and done kind of situation, but these iterative decisions become very important in the culture and the sentiments of the partners. And because consensus, which is really effectively agreeing, I think you'll find that the more partners agree, the more they will find the partnership agreeable. But another way to look at it is to say, consensus as opposed to what? So the value of consensus we can see perhaps better by looking at what the alternatives would be. And just because I have to go through this quickly, I'm just going to click on to the next slide and say that from a structure and design perspective, there's at least two very clear alternatives, two obvious other ways you can go. One is, of course, no shared decision making. And that's not uncommon. There are plenty of partnerships where the partners decide that they want to delegate everything to the supporting entity, whether as trustee or secretariat or implementer. They're very happy to defer all the responsibility and the decision-making, and they might just be an advisory governing body or consultative governing body. But then the other, perhaps obvious alternative is voting. And voting is fractional decision-making. So you might say, what's wrong with voting? So I have in my primer, just to quote from there, where I deal with this in more detail, voting opens the door to dissenting partners, and those can also become minority blocs. And generally, voting can usher in disruption and divisiveness, right? And so, of course, there's plenty of voting going on, especially in a corporate context. In private companies, the boards are normally on a voting basis. But in our environment here with international partnership programs, any amount of disruption or divisiveness, you might end up weeding out people who don't agree, partners who don't agree, but it is not a way to maintain inclusivity or to achieve buy-in, which is of course what these partnerships often have as goals. As I put it in my primer, no splits, no splinters. All right, but then of course I always have people who come and say, oh, but I can't afford to do consensus because we have to make sure that we don't get paralyzed. We have to be able to make this work, and we can't hold everyone hostage to one or two contrarians. So there's a lot of angst around not doing voting and moving to consensus. So let me try to dispel a little bit of that through at least a few suggestions on how to handle these environments. And the first one is one that you've heard me talk about before. It's kind of a common thread that goes through this, and that is choosing your partners wisely. So it really, from the beginning, you can help influence your consensus environment in the choices you make. And here, I just want to emphasize, you really do have a choice. This is not a procurement type setting where you have, fairness standards and transparency and competition going on. This is more like choosing your significant other. You can choose your partners. And I use the word like-minded a lot. It's a certain level of compatibility, but when I looked at my primer, I think I used that word just about every dozen pages. So it is, It is a theme that's really important to making a lot of these different elements work. And of course, you can test this compatibility early on. If you are negotiating an establishment document like a charter, if you find that those negotiations are difficult, that you're just not getting there, that should be a red flag to you as to whether you're choosing your partners in a way that will be effective in a really collaborative environment. A second thing is to think about this decision-making as a process rather than a product. It's not that you just are getting an end result, but the iterative effort to get to that result is also of value. It's one of the reasons you come together as partners in these international partnership programs, to give everyone a voice, to have a collective buy-in for the things you want to do. And of course it takes work, but if you believe that the outcome is worth the effort, then the process is as much a part of the product as the decision at the end of the day. Now, even if you do all this, if you choose your partners wisely and you look at this more iteratively and appreciate the process involved, you may still end up in situations where things just aren't happening, where maybe there's one or the other partner that is blocking the ability of the partnership to proceed. And in that sense, I would encourage you to think about two directions: escalating up and expanding out. The escalation is when you look at, usually it's a particular individual or individuals at the table because they're the representatives of the partner. You may find that if you move beyond the individual and escalate it within the partnering institution, which of course can be politically sensitive, but it may give you an avenue for trying to find a resolution to be able to move forward. And the expansion piece, is that the secretariat, for example, should never feel like this is just their problem to fix. So if the views just aren't gelling, it is appropriate to make it an issue for the whole partnership and for the partners themselves to try to find a solution, rather than leaving the secretariat feeling like they're holding the bag. And I could say the same thing about the chair position, to expand it within the partnership to try to resolve any blockages. But my fourth point is that you may really end up hitting a place where your reality check tells you that it's not working. And then it is perhaps appropriate to think about resetting, to transform the partnership, or to wind it down and start a new partnership. So these are all avenues when you have challenges in a consensus environment that may help you make it work better. But having said that, I also have number 5, which is to say that knowing how consensus works is going to make a difference to your ability to navigate consensus and maximize its value. It's interesting, for consensus, at the end of the day, the only thing that really matters about it is that individual partners carry a veto. And everyone carries a veto, and each one is equal to every other veto. This is not a vote. But if you have basically no vote and you have no veto that's expressed, it's not even an overt decision. So consensus happens in that the chair may be sitting around at the table and the partners finish discussing, and the chair says, okay, it looks like there are no objections here, so it's approved. Let's move on to the next agenda item. Or I think we have consensus, so I think we can just move on and take this as approved. It's as simple as a chair being able to confirm that the views in the room are agreed. And if anyone disagrees, of course, they would speak up at that moment and say, oh, no, I have my objection, or I have my concern. So it is this kind of informal, we agree, unless someone exercises the veto. And that's where it really matters. But even with that, it's important to understand that this is not a black and white situation. This is not an up or down, yes or no. It is much more shaded and nuanced than that. And in that sense, it can be very fit for purpose. And we can start by looking at the composition of the governing body itself. So I have this little diagram for my primer. In the broadest sense, you've got a lot of people in the room, and that could include secretariat staff and other people who are just helping out. But then beyond that, you have people who are legitimately entitled to have voice at the table, who are able to speak and be part of the conversation, part of the deliberations. And that can include both decision makers and observers. So it's active observers who can be as much a part of the discussion as anyone else. So that's a nice distinction that you can make in terms of figuring out who is part of that consensus and who's just contributing to the consensus. Because at the very top of the pyramid is the select group of decision makers, each of which would carry this veto. And it's really important, and that's where charters come in, that you're able to spell out which partners are in which of these categories and use these categories to make decision-making more effective. But as to consensus decision-making itself, it's also not an up or down. It's not just a red or a green, stop or go. There is a yellow zone. And the very clear one is that you can simply abstain. You can just say, I'm not taking a position. I neither say yes or no. I am basically recusing myself, taking myself out of this particular decision point, and I abstain. And that would be something that could be put on the record so that it's very clear as part of the minutes for the decision-making process. But you can also go one step further. And this is really where that nuance comes in. You can also dissent without blocking the decision. So you may find for policy reasons, or maybe there's a particular aspect that you don't like, and you want to be on record as saying that, but you don't want to hold up the project for everyone else. So you can state your objection, but you can make it clear that it's not blocking the decision. So it's not an outright veto, it's simply something for the record. I have seen this used extremely effectively. Henrietta, I'm thinking of an example in the Global Concessional Financing Facility where we salvaged a project and everybody got their press release, and the partner that had an issue was able to put it in the record. And you can also use this for contingencies, for conditions, for other things that partners around the table want to make part of the decision-making without actually imposing a veto and blocking the decision. Now, I'm sure I'm running out of time, so let me just quickly say a moment on no objection decision-making. So there's physical decision-making, which is in the meeting, which is where we do consensus decision-making, but there's also virtual decision-making, which is between meetings, and that's what we call no objection decision-making. And when we look at the two side by side, you can see the main difference is that physical meetings are in real time. So it doesn't mean we have to be in the same room. We can be Zooming like we are right now, but it has to be contemporaneous. And for that, use of the word consensus is appropriate. In the digital exchanges, which is extenuated in virtual space over time, that's where we talk about no objection decision-making. But what's really interesting is, and the way that this works, what makes it work well, is to be very clear about the parameters. And note that both of these are very finite processes. They have set participants. We know who the decision makers are on a set decision point, which is hopefully clearly indicated what is being decided, with set procedures. Hopefully everyone knows in advance how it works, and within a set time period. So in a meeting, it's real time, and in no objection, it should have a defined time period during which the decision-making runs. So as far as no objection processes, I don't have time to go through that here, but I have a whole page in my primer with my 10 steps, 10 to-dos as to different things to be alert to and to make it function properly. But I can encapsulate it in the little ditty that I have in my book for builders, which is, when it comes to no objection, silence is consent, provided that the email was well and truly sent. So here's a thing that is really valuable to be aware of. If you notice, consensus and no objection decision-making have a default position, which is agreement. So by default, everyone is agreeing unless there is an objection. And it only takes one to object. but you're starting with this default. And that's very different from voting. When you're voting, there is no default position. You vote and you figure out what the answer is. What's nice about consensus decision-making and no objection is that this default agreement position ends up being very efficient. And not only that, they are very efficient with each other. So if you're a partnership program that's based on consensus decision-making, it is a total natural to move to no objection decision-making between meetings, because it's the same premise. It makes it very compatible, and in fact, it makes it very interchangeable. Very quickly on this, because I know we don't have time, because I always love to talk about charters, and my new book has a lot on charters. Charters are adopted. These are the documents that are kind of common statements of the partnership that are collectively owned. And they're different from signed agreements. And note that adoption is a form of decision-making. So if you do adoption through consensus, it makes the partnership more collectively owned. It's a very powerful decision-making modus for charters. But even more interesting is that it not only helps with the adoption, but it helps with the amendments. So that as you're adopting through consensus, you can also amend through consensus in your charters. And that is a very cool foundational way to keep everyone on board for your partnership. And even more interesting for the geeks of us who love this stuff, when you bring in the carryover effect and you have charters that can be amended and at the same time amend contribution agreements for your trust funds. Now, these are signed agreements being amended through an adoption process. And I describe all this in my books. When you do that, you truly have a powerful engine to stay fit for purpose. And we are actually full circle back to the first topic that we discussed in October, which was my like rock, like water description of how to keep stability within a partnership while you're also enabling flexibility. And I find, because I always like to make connections, there are so many threads here, but consensus is a bedrock element for being able to make all of these things work really well. So that is my punchline for this Structure 1515. There is a lot more in my books, of course. The Primer for Partners, which has been out for a couple of years, and the book for Builders that just came out. And we have really accomplished a lot. We've done 7 Structure 1515s. We're going to take a break for the summer, and I'm really open to your thoughts if you want to email me or put something in the chat as to the approach that you might like. I'll be thinking about maybe a different format to pick up in the fall, but hope to continue this community of practice and have really appreciated your engagement with this. And it's time for conversation. So let me pull out the share and see if any of you, I hope this didn't go too quickly, if especially those of you who are new and don't have the benefit of all of our progression to get to this point, but would love to hear. Maybe some of you actually have partnerships that don't operate on consensus. How's that going? Or maybe you didn't realize that consensus is actually this rich and makes such a difference. Any thoughts from you are very welcome. Thank you.
Andrea, this is Claire. I had
Hey, Claire.
a question. Hi.
Yes.
I had a question or comment, and it's something that I've noticed when you're working with different governments sometimes, and when you talked about the period where you might have an email exchange and not responding, it was saying that you consented in some sort. What I've recognized in government, sometimes you have to have consensus with your higher ups before you can respond. And I wanted you to see if you could, it may take a lifetime period. So I'd be interested how that gets incorporated.
Yeah, so let me just respond to that quickly, and others may have had their experiences. So this partly goes to the idea that when I talk about structure, I'm not just talking about the nuts and bolts, but also the processes that go with it. So the design elements. And for something like this, particularly in the environment, and the thing you're talking about, which would be no objection decision-making, it is so important that people understand the rules before you launch the decision-making. So if people understand the process, you've given them a heads up, okay, this is how it's going to work. And you need to do your part to plug into this process. And we're going to rely on you to do your part. We can't do everything for you. So for example, when I draft charters and I talk about the no objection process, I always put in a sentence that says who's responsible for providing the current contact information for the specific representatives. And I do not make the secretariat responsible. They are not going to be able to chase everyone. I say each member that has this decision-making right is responsible. And even the observers, because often the observers get the material, they get the information and are informed even if they're not decision-making. But I say, you are responsible to tell the secretariat who your current members are. And if you switched your representative and you didn't tell us that it's somebody else, or they went on vacation and they don't have an alternate, don't look to us. You have to be able to do that. The other thing is to, when you send out the email request and you have the materials attached and so on, you put in there very clearly, deadline for the no objection period is, and then you state the date. And maybe you send out a reminder, you help people along with that, but it should be very clear. It's not forever. We actually need a decision point. But if you do those kinds of things, it's kind of housekeeping, then usually partners are very appreciative of what is truly an efficient mechanism for making decisions. I have also seen it very effectively utilized where a secretariat or a chair will send out a no objection request, and a partner will look at it and say, oh, I'm not ready to decide. I need more time. I need conversation. I don't want to do this decision without having heard from my other partners. Or, they need something. Then you say, I object because I need A, B, or C. I object because I want to discuss it in person at the next meeting. I object because until I get answers to these 3 questions, I don't think I'm ready to respond. And you can decide whether it's an objection that's public to everyone or whether it's a one-off where you talk to the sponsor of the decision. So there's different modalities, but you always have that veto. No one's going to force you to approve the no objection. And you can use that veto to modulate whether you're in a no objection mode or moving into a consensus mode in a meeting context. And partners like to know that they have that leeway. So, there's more we could say on that, but I think there are, again, if you understand the parameters of how the decision-making works and everyone around the table understands those, you can navigate some of what might otherwise be challenging situations and prevent them from happening. Nicola, I see your hand.
Yeah, that I love what you've laid out, and it made me cast my mind back to, we tended in the program that I was managing, we tended to operate on consensus, and then we started to discuss a new model of voting, which broke down, and we ended up solving it by consensus.
Love it.
which I think you may want to include that as a story somewhere. But to go to Claire's point, sometimes there will be a one-off where a partner who normally would be able to respond within the set no objection period won't be able to for reasons that are proper to them. Who knows? So in the secretariat, usually what we would do in the secretariat, that partner would communicate with us, or we'd follow up with them. And they'd say, look, I really need a few more days. I'll get you, I will get you our response, but we really need a few more days. If it was just a few more days, we would very transparently say the deadline has been, we would extend the deadline for everyone, not just for that one partner, but we would say, okay, because we've had a few requests or because of a request from this one partner, we're extending the deadline to X so that it would be done transparently. I think,
yeah, and it's interesting.
A great question.
There's so many modalities there. I've seen cases where someone objected kind of out of the box, and then other partners rallied and tried to persuade that partner not to object. And then within the time period, the objection was retracted. So you have the ability to object and then retract your objection if you want to. So, that kind of dynamic can easily happen. So within that time period, and as Nicola said, we're all going to be reasonable. We can also say that the charter said, 14-day minimum. But if it's going to be like an urgent decision, the Secretariat can send out the no objection request, and can say, we're giving ourselves 7 days. And if we hear no objection to the 7 days, we're going to go ahead. Now, technically, maybe somebody wasn't paying attention and, then we'll figure it out. But in theory, these kinds of clear statements within the partnership context are very manageable for the no objection decision making. Especially if you have a secretariat that's keeping, I always say too, it's the secretariat that is going to manage no objection processes, not the chair, not everybody, the secretariat, and then that usually helps things along.
And maybe the one other point is to do all the work in advance, so that the
Yes.
the consultative process, that's really where all of the objections that might arise, all of the different perspectives are taken care of, so that the proposal that's finally put forward is a proposal that the Secretariat already has a good flavor of the partnership to know that at the very least, if it's not all thumbs up, it's thumbs sideways. There are not going to be any thumbs down.
Yeah, those are really effective secretariats that are able to make that work. And there's maybe one more kind of case, which is if you start the no objection period and you get objections, and the idea is, I don't like the fact that you don't have, a gender analysis in your project proposal. And then you say, but I'm willing to look at it again once you've put that in. Then the Secretariat goes back to the sponsor, they work out that piece, they probably even go bilaterally to the one with the objection, make sure it's okay. And then you start a new objection period and you send it out, but you're very disciplined and you're saying, okay, new proposal, new request, new objection period, and now, here's the end of the objection period. So it just should be very clean and systematic that way. So I should say we are at the half-hour mark easily. I'm very happy to keep going, but anyone who feels they need to leave, of course, don't hesitate. And if we run out of things to talk about, I have one more slide I can show you about terminology, if there's interest
Henrietta
in that.
has her hand.
Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. Henrietta, please. Thanks, Nicola.
Andrea, this is great. It's interesting to see you presenters. So for those who don't know, I've worked together with Andrea on designing the global concessional financing facility. She on the side of the World Bank, I am at the UN. We made it work, but that was one of those consensus building processes of which I think we all learned a lot.
Yeah.
I have one comment to make, and that's basically using your terminology, Andrea, is also who are the decision makers? Because it's not always clear, like who has a veto and who's an observer.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a concrete case where I was renegotiating legal agreements, and a certain member state, we thought they were an observer, and then that person, the representative changed, and the new person came and said, no, I feel I have a veto.
Right.
At the end of a process, and then you said, well, listen, you had already, and what I found is then as a secretariat or whoever is then the convener, having your paper trail, all your emails where you're able to send out all the emails, say, you got this email in October last year, November last year, February this year, April this year, now it's June, we're 2 weeks before signing off and you only now come in. Okay.
Yeah, so very interesting, Henrietta.
Another
Yes.
way of getting people to say like, okay, good, I abstain instead of vetoing something.
Yeah.
Besides, but that requires a professionalism of your secretariat function to be able to say, well, listen, you've had so many opportunities to bring in your concerns. If you haven't engaged with the process from the beginning and you come in very late and then you claim your veto right, while we were on the impression that you were an observer, Okay, so this is just one thing I was thinking of as you were going through the process.
Well, and let me comment in the sense that you're actually talking about a period of time which is kind of the twilight zone, because I think you're talking about the time before you've actually launched the partnership, established, you know, maybe adopted the charter, you know, really figured out the rules. You don't know yet who the official members of the governing body are, but you're canvassing your prospective partners to be able to get closure on the terms for the partnership to proceed. And that's a pretty vulnerable moment. And it is harder to be clear in that environment as to who's actually, quote unquote, a decision maker in the establishment sense versus, you know, just an observer, or, you know, you just don't have a veto. I think the way that that ultimately needs to work is that you have to, one, be as clear as possible. And Henrietta, I know, for example, in the GCFF context, we had a working group, and there was some clarity as to who was part of the working group and some understanding that the working group members were the ones who had decision-making power. So you can use structural tools even before the partnership is formed to be able to create that kind of clarity. But the other may simply be that at a certain point in time, the partners that matter, you know, in quotes, the partners that matter will decide what is the critical mass and who absolutely needs to be on board. So this country that you had that was objecting, you know, maybe they were more peripheral and everyone else was willing to go forward, and then you politically make a decision to proceed. And that partner can decide whether to come along or not. Or they are so critical that you know that you cannot proceed. Like if it's your supporting entity, if your supporting entity vetoes anything, you know you're not proceeding, right? They're just, it's that central to the partnership program. So some of these may be more judgment calls as to where the critical mass is for you to be able to move forward. But of course, it's much better to avoid these kinds of situations and try to navigate the politics in advance before it blows up at a late stage in the game. So I appreciate the example that you were providing. What do y'all think? Are you interested in a little terminology? Maybe I will pull this slide up here. And here's a question for you. It's not meant to be a quiz. But we have 4 words: adopt, approve, ratify, and endorse. Which of these entail decision points? I've already, you have a leg up because I've already told you in one of the slides that adoption is a form of decision making. So I think you can put adopt and approve in the decision making category. But I wonder what you think about endorsement and ratify. I have seen many charters floated my way, you know, draft documents or even, you know, approved documents that say the governing body endorses the annual work plan, but we're not decision making. We're just advisory. We're just consultative. The governing body ratifies the strategy that was approved by the supporting entity, but just advisory. So I know people try to parse these terms, but I'm going to be much more legalistic about it, I guess would be the word, and suggest to you that this is not a question of whether you're acting or reacting. It doesn't matter if you're endorsing something that was already approved by someone else, or if you're ratifying something that was, you know, already went through the approval process elsewhere. The real test is whether the action can be blocked. And that is essentially the consensus question of, is there a right of a veto? And normally when you use the word ratification or endorsement, there is some expectation of power behind that word, behind the verb. It's not, but even if it were just a rubber stamp, it is still has some meaning to it. So the idea would be that I would take the position that it is still a decision point if you're endorsing or ratifying, and essentially is the same thing as approval. So I would not say that parsing these words gets you anywhere. I know people like to do it, but I don't think it actually does from a consensus the functional point of view. And so to just put a point on it, you cannot have an advisory body that endorses or ratifies unless you have a contradiction in terms. So maybe that slide also reminds you of documents that you've seen in the past. Okay, that was the bonus slide. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah, Jane, go ahead.
Can I just speak to that? Because I think that, for example, all of the new umbrella trust fund programs that the bank is rolling out now,
Yeah,
in fact, place the decision-making power for, you know, specific things like grants and work program and so forth with the bank as the trustee.
Yeah.
And yet the donor councils that are, you know, I don't know whether they're governing, there seem to be both internal and external governing bodies in these programs. So for example, a lot of what you describe about the procedures for making decisions, that applies to technical advisory committees that are in the bank that actually make decisions about the grants. So the one that I worked on most recently was the State and Peace Building Fund, and they, you know, have a rapid approvals for grants because of the context. And so, but they have rules for decisions and so forth, and they have a lot of the processes. But then the donor council is very much in this advisory, endorsing, ratifying, which I agree with you is like a little bit fuzzy. And but the fact is, my feeling is that a lot of the secretariats of these programs, the program management teams in the bank now are so sensitive to the politics of the donors that if a donor doesn't endorse or doesn't ratify, they're going to be very, very sensitive to that because, you know, given the, yeah, I mean, I think they are all the time, but especially now with donor funding being increasingly scarce. So I think what you say about it being an actual decision, even though it's not like designed as, you know, described as a very hard decision, it still has a lot of power. And the other thing I would say, and I think this follows up on what Claire was saying earlier, is you need a chair that's an empowered chair of this consensus, someone either like a G-level staff that has a manager behind them, or you need a person of gravitas and reputation, or somebody who's empowered to drive that consensus, which I think you described really well. And just to say, overall, your work is so fantastic. I wish we'd had it 20 years ago.
It's never too late, right? I'm hoping anyhow. Well, it's so interesting, Jane, and you have so much experience to draw from, but I think you're saying a number of things. One thing that you're saying that is kind of out there, but doesn't always get articulated, is that the power of the purse already carries an effective veto. It's not the case always, but donors have a huge veto power implicit in their funding and the you know, essential nature of that funding. And it's obviously a very competitive environment. So more than ever, supporting entities, secretariats, other partners are going to be very deferential to what donors have to say. But of course, we don't want donors to abuse that. And so it's also really nice to be able to say to donors, here's how far your rights go, but to also, you know, push back a little bit. I think there's some appropriateness to saying we're a collective, and just because you have this particular agenda doesn't mean that that's appropriate for everybody's priorities and strategies. The point of being a collaborative governing body is to give everyone the opportunity to weigh in. And if you're, you know, a developing country sitting on that body and you don't have the power of the purse, it shouldn't be that your voice counts so much less just because you can't leverage it the same way. So that, I think that's one of the things that you're touching on. Another is that this idea of the chair, I mean, I actually, in my book for builders, I have a clause for the chair. I give you a lot of annotations about what to think about for the chair. Just like the way I talk about secretariats, you know, very special skill set, I will also say that about the chair. And you don't just need someone with gravitas. I mean, it's nice if they have that, but you also need someone with a lot of finesse and the same kind of savvy, inward-outward ability that secretariats have, because you're one of those nexus points as the chair that's going to make things work or not work. And the chair's role around consensus is crucial. And you can imagine, I'm sure you've seen scenarios, if a chair is not paying attention to the room and is bulldozing through decisions, and there's not true consensus behind it, or there wasn't an artful way to articulate the objection without making it a veto, or there wasn't a way to take a break and have a conversation in the hallway, which, you know, Henrietta, we did in the GCFF when we had to deal with the objection that almost tanked the proposal. You know, there are ways to deliver the closure, the end result, and a chair, if they're very good, can do that. But I don't know, is anyone out there training chairs to do this? You know, it can make a big difference in how a partnership functions. But yeah, I mean, I think your points are very well taken. And I would echo, I think that the way people are using words, you know, I'm too much of a lawyer not to pay attention to the individual words. The way people are using approve and ratify and endorse is not helpful, because it would be much better if we were clear with each other as to where we're drawing the lines on decision making versus just input. And I knowing what the umbrella documents look like for the bank, it's interesting to me that most of the verbs that you see there are review, that the governing body will review, which is a consultative advisory process, as opposed to approve, ratify, or endorse. And I'm working with a partnership program right now at the bank that is grandfathering into an umbrella program, and they only have review for everything, including their annual work plan. And my advice to them is, it's working. You don't need to give them more rights. It's a functioning, you know, everybody's happy. Review is good because it will still give them enough influence in this particular case. So we don't have to push to get to approve, and can still have a very meaningful, productive, consultative, collaborative environment.
Yeah, Andre, the only thing I would add to this is that, like, this idea of, I agree that review is a much better word and a better description of what these committees are doing. But the idea of power of proposal, I think, is huge here. And that's where, when you have this effective secretariat that's professional and with all the skills that you mentioned, that, you know, this idea, because in the distant past, before we had a clear sense of, you know, like you can't just have these partnerships be free-for-alls, there used to be this idea that one of the donors would, you know, propose things to the group, and, you know, they would all have like governance roles in this partnership. And you had, you know, I remember a DFID representative telling me, oh yes, I'm governing this partnership. And, you know, she would be developing all these proposals and submitting them. And it just, I don't think that is a good role, a good use of the donors, because they do have a very strong role in designing the thing up front and signing the contribution agreement and whatever. And then after that, honestly, if you have, you know, 5 or 6 of these donors all you know, proposing, you know, so I think that, you know, the power of proposal coming from the Secretariat is a good thing to think about.
Yeah, I love that. I thought you misspoke at first, that you were referring to the power of the purse, but no, you're actually talking about a different power. And because I'm so big on alliteration, I think it is really neat to look at the power of the purse, but also the power of proposal. And you're absolutely right. The ability, particularly of the supporting entity, to propose, to put things on the table, is a very valuable foundation for a lot of partnerships, because they end up relying on the Secretariat to do that. And the ability of others to do the proposal can be very disrupting or chaotic. You know, it shouldn't be that way. But I think the way to look at that, and in my Secretariat chapter, I talk about different roles of the Secretariat, and one of them is the clearinghouse role, the kind of channel, the gatekeeper. And for orderly functioning, if you have a good Secretariat, it can still be a very open channel, but it would end up going through the Secretariat before it hits the governing body. And that does a lot of things. It creates order. It allows it to be coordinated and aligned with other activities. And also the Secretariat can make sure that it's not running afoul of the institutional policies and procedures that would necessarily come to bear. So this Secretariat Clearinghouse coordinating central nexus role in conjunction with the power of proposal that you're talking about is actually a very nice way to make sure that decision-making has a clear order to it and is teed up nicely, but obviously with the opportunity for others to have input either before or after or during. Yeah, I like that. I hope you don't mind if you see that crop up in my stuff at some point. Power of proposal. Good. Any other thoughts? We may be getting to our.
Yeah. Can I,
Yeah.
Andrea? Hi, Andrea. Thank you for the great
Eva,
session.
thank you for
My
joining.
First,
Yes.
I'm very happy to be part of this discussion. I have a question. I'm not sure if it's the content of this particular session, but we were talking about the no objection process and the role of the chair. Could you tell us more, like, what are the options for the chair when faced with a situation of harsh no objection, of a harsh objection to a proposal that is actually blocking? So it may be, for example, from a major player. What are the options not to lose also the progress that was made during this consensual process that led basically to that decision point? I have some experience when I was advising the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee at the European Parliament, where, as you can imagine, between national and political party interests, it was quite a lot to work on, to really find consensus every time there was a law to be passed. And sometimes it was hard to find the right balance between kind of moving forward with still kind of following the line of this consensual process versus sometimes just taking a decision that might have been isolating for some, right? And creating some kind of, let's say, discontent. So I'm curious about your thoughts. Thanks.
Oh, Eva, thank you so much. And actually what's really great about your question is you are kind of testing the applicability of things that I've been saying in a very different context. And I tend to think that a lot of what I write about international partnership programs has a much greater application to many other areas and maybe life generally, if you want to look there. So obviously the European Parliament is going to be a much more challenging environment than the kind of international partnership program that I'm advocating that we learn how to build. And in that sense, things that I've been saying here may simply not be very effective, but it still depends a lot on, the different navigating tools that you have. But it underscores in a way that when you do these international partnership programs, you're not in a parliamentary situation. You really are trying to find those partners that are going to work well together to have the kind of impact and to reach the kind of goals that you're looking to reach. But maybe, not to take too long in responding to this point, it's worth saying that at the end of the day, sometimes things simply are not going to be agreed. So consensus is the goal, but you may simply hit points where it's not a go. It's not a decision that everyone wants to jump on. And if a particular project is sufficiently flawed or has a risk profile that does not fit within the risk appetite of the partners, or has not been developed adequately for partners to feel like they know what they're agreeing to, those are all points at which one or more partners may simply say, no, I'm not going there. I can't approve this. And partnership programs also need to learn how to absorb those kinds of decisions that are non-approval decisions and recognize that even those are within a collaborative spirit where all partners are being valued, and that you then pick up and you figure out, should we do a revised proposal? Should we change our approach? International partnership programs have the ability to do that in a way that a European Parliament cannot really. But I think it is fair for all the partners from the beginning to understand that they're part of a collective and they will collectively move forward. And consensus lets you do that. So ideally, you know, even those things are not viewed as setbacks, but just part of the process of doing the collaboration and finding that collective action. So I think we should stop here just because we're losing some people and we're at the hour. But I want to thank everyone for participating and stay tuned. We will pick up again in the fall, and again, open to your thoughts on how you would like to do this. And of course, be in touch at any time in any way. It would be great to continue some of these conversations on the side. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.